Welcome on in, golf fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our DFS value plays for this week's Fortinet Championship. Gonna go through the bottom end of the Draftkings pricing and give you 4 salary saving plays you can get to open up some salary towards the top end of the board, spend up for an extra stud or two, and hopefully get some much needed ownership leverage as well to find yourself towards the top of those GPPs. The idea here is to try and open up a little bit of flexibility when it comes to how you're building your lineup, but also try and get some of the leverage that you need as well. Towards the top, middle of the board, a lot of the ownership is condensed, but the further down the board you're willing to go, the lower ownership numbers you're going to find as well. So it's, a double bonus there. You're able to spend up for extra salary elsewhere, and you're also making sure that you're unique from the rest of the field. So a lot to get into here. Let's go ahead and start it off with our first diamond of the week. If you've seen my videos on the course already, maybe my core plays video, you'll know that pretty much any type of player can get it done here if they have their best stuff. There's not really one type of skill set that's going to dominate over the others. We've had bombers win here. We've had shorter plotters get the job done, young up-and-comers, and of course wily veterans like a Stuart Sink. So if you're trying to narrow down, a specific skill set to play this week, I think there's a few that you could gander at, but really that's not something that I'm doing out here, right? I'm more so worried about long-term pedigree, perhaps a little bit of course history around Silverado, North Course, and going on from there. So we're going to start it off with a shorter plotter type of player in Christian Bezuidenhout, but our second place, Sam Stevens, who we'll talk about here in just a few minutes, couldn't really be the opposite, right? One of them's a long bomber player like a Stevens, long iron specialist, and on the other hand, we got Christian Bezuidenhout, who's much more of a short iron and putting type of specialist. So we'll talk through some of the reasons why that's the case, but more importantly, why I like these players in particular. So a lot of it comes down to ownership. So you'll see on here, we have our ownership tab updated. Of course, on the Patreon, guys, we have ownership for the entire field loaded in, but for these 4 specific plays, you're going to be getting some sort of leverage here. And one of the plays is going to be just slightly over 10% owned. So I wouldn't call them a pivot by any means, but still not atrocious, right? Not like a super chalky play that you have to fade by any circumstance. So first off, Bezuidenhout, I like the long-term form. The further you zoom out on a Bezuidenhout, the better that it gets. He's getting about 0.6 strokes per round, which is an elite tier player in this week of a field, gaining half a stroke per round with the approach play, and gaining just about the same there with the putter. If you zoom in a little bit, you can see it pretty much holds up. It's the same kind of stat profile. Maybe not as good with the approach play, but still gaining with the short game and the putter there. And in general, we know what to expect with Bezuidenhout, right? He's not very long off the tee. He does miss his fair share of fairways as well. So the off the tee play is usually not going to be a bright spot for him. He's not typically going to gain many strokes when it comes to the shots gained off the tee, but he is capable of gaining everywhere else, right? From, approach play, around the green, putter are always going to be positives for Christian Bezuidenhout. And in this kind of field, he can really separate himself with those 3 categories. It's of course where you've seen shorter, even older players like Stuart Sink get the job done. And Bezuidenhout has the same, if not more firepower than a Stuart Sink at this stage. So I think he could get it done here, right? I mean, ideally, you want players that could take advantage of the par 5s. That's where you're going to see some separation out there. But Bezuidenhout, with his about 300-yard carry, should be able to take care of all 4 on site. So I like that. I like the fact that he can take care of the par 5s. PM wave tee time doesn't look like there's going to be a huge split between the 2 waves as of right now. So pretty much checks every box we're looking for. If we take a look at the event history, he is not played here. So one of the few players that doesn't have course history around Silverado. In recent form, of course, hasn't played very often, right? His last start was a T51, and that was at the Wyndham Championship. Missed the cut at the Wyndham, but then did make the cut at the Open. So we haven't seen him play very often, which is keeping the ownership number at least a little bit lower than it should be. You have a few players around him that also haven't played very much, like a Pendrith not getting much attention, like even a Cam Champ, right, who's won at this golf course before. Not really the hot commodities. The ones that are getting a little bit chalky are a little bit more expensive. You have a lot of people spending up for Doug Gim, for example. Even just the 8K range in general is much higher owned than what you'd have down here in the 7s. And then this middle tier of the 7K range, the Dylan Woos of the world, like I think especially out there, are getting a ton of ownership. So it feels like the top end of the 7s here, it's not really just Bezuidenhout, is a little bit of a dead zone when it comes to ownership. And I think a great example of a player that you can get to here, one of a few that I'll probably play this week, is Seabass, right? Just a better player player than his peers, right? Gains about half a stroke per round in this field in terms of recent form. He's you can see that puts him at right around the average there. Just actually, he's slightly losing over his last 12. But if you were to zoom out to the last 36, right, give him more of a baseline, which by the way, if you're looking at like the last 12 rounds and making a lot of decisions this week, probably not the best strategy, right? You got to figure they've had at least a month off. A lot of players 5 to 6 weeks away from golf. You got to reset them to a longer term baseline, right? That recent form is no longer so recent, right? It's an entire month ago at this point. A lot of them took time away from golf. I'm sure a lot went on vacation over those last 4 weeks. I'm much more worried about, last year, how did they play, right? In general, not really the last few months. And for Gsluke, in terms of the price tag here, I think there's a little bit of disrespect going on because of the lack of recent form, which again, doesn't really matter. It's not really recent. Next up, we've got Sam Stevens, a completely different type of player, right? More of the plotter putter type up here with Gsluke. This is the long off the tee specialist. So I mentioned the par 5 as being, relatively important this week, being able to eagle them, pretty much reach all of them in 2. But Sam Stevens in general and weak field events has been exceptional, right? He's been, had some of his best performances at some of the weaker field events, whether it's an alternate field event, whether it was the fall swing last year where you had a few of those top 25s. He's a ball striker, in some of the stronger fields out there, right? He has some of the better ball striking stats, especially with the long irons on the PGA Tour. The issue's the putter, right? If we take a look at the last 12 measured rounds, you can see he's right about a neutral with the flat stick, which, believe it or not, is great. He's just been horrible with the approach play. So as of right now, I don't have him super chalky at just 9.1%. If Sam Stevens was playing like the last 36 rounds, he'd be a whole lot more chalky, let me tell you that. He's only losing 0.3 strokes per round, so it's closer to a neutral. Over the 24 rounds in front of that, he's actually a slight positive in that category. Gaining a bunch of strokes off the tee, and you can see slightly losing with the flat stick. The flat stick is almost always going to be a negative. You're going to need him to have a spike week to go out there and get that top 10 finish. But this approach play is way, way better than the stats indicate. Like if you look at the stats from just the entire year last year, Sam Stevens is one of the better approach players in the field, right? Let alone down here in the 7K range. He's super elite off the tee, one of the better off the tee players in the world, let alone in this kind of field, and is a spike putter, right? He has his weeks where he'll go out there, gain 2-3 strokes with the flat stick. I like all of that for Sam Stevens. So he's a high upside play. I'd say a little bit risky, right? Because he kind of fell apart towards the last few months. But kind of like Gsluke, I like getting to these long-term, just, really good players, right? Stalwarts out there in the tour last year that maybe struggled towards the end. They've had the month to reset, figure out what's going on, maybe not even play that much golf, just hit that reset button that a lot of these guys need. And then now that we get them in a weak field event, they can go out there and really shine. So Sam Stevens, especially if he's going to be sub 10% ownership, I think is one of the better GPP plays you can get to on the entire slate. Before we hop into our last 2 plays, I'll remind you guys, if you want access to everything you see here on the spreadsheet, so everything that's blacked out, including my player pool and ownership for all 156 players in the field, well, go out there and check out my Patreon. There's a link down below. You can get access to all my DFS content on there, also all the prop content that I'm posting, and all of the NFL content that we're posting for Showdown and main slates throughout the year. A lot of content coming out here on the YouTube this time, but even more content behind the paywall on Patreon. And on there is where you can get an idea of exactly what I'm working with every single week. There's a lot of research tools on there, of course, projections for every single slate. That includes Showdown and main slates for golf and football. But mostly, right, you get a lot of the strategy side of things, right? We talk about why I'm getting to certain players. I talk about the certain ownership fades, game theory fades you can take for every single slate, which isn't meant to be a direct tail. It's more so to give you insight into how I'm approaching the slate, right? You can choose to take bits and pieces, right, incorporate them as your own, or just use it as perspective to go out there and craft your own narrative, right? Especially for Showdown slates, whether it be for golf or out there for football, right, in terms of game scripts. A lot of info on there. All of it is to help you out with your process, make it a little bit simpler, a little bit more straightforward. So check it out down below if you haven't already. Alrighty, shameless plug aside, let's hop into our last 2 plays, which first off, we got Nate Lashley at $7,400. This is the one kind of chalky value play that we're getting to here, but I really like Nate Lashley this week, right? He's like that one piece of chalk that I just can't let go. A few reasons why. Over the last 36 rounds, he's been much better than most people would assume, right? Gaining a bunch of strokes on approach and with the putter over there. And at this golf course, has an exceptional track record. So if we take a look at his course history around here, you'll see that he had 55th last year, a 16th, a couple missed cuts, and then a 17th place finish, which is, 2 top 25s. It's 3 of 5 made cuts. For somebody of Nate Lashley's pedigree, that's a pretty solid track record, right? It's not earth shattering by any means, but it's pretty damn solid. The icing on the cake here is that the Detroit Golf Club Rocket Mortgage Classic is my #1 comp course. It's the same type of greens, a lot of wedges into that golf course. It's a par 72, a lot of different parallels that you could make between the two tracks, and he won there before, right? It was his breakthrough win, got him his tour card. It's why he's a professional golfer on the PGA Tour. He also has a lot of decent finishes there outside of that, so a lot of crossover that you can make. He already played well at this golf course. He's playing well coming in, so I think the 10% ownership number is a little bit steep, but there are guys around him sniffing that ownership, right? You got Grayson Sigg, who's like 6-7%, Kevin Yu, who's actually higher owned than a Nate Lashley, so he's not egregious chalk, right? He's getting attention. I think it's deservingly so, and as long as you're differentiating with a few other spots in your lineup, it's not an issue, right? But let's say you're starting with some chalk up there in the 9-10K range, maybe even a chalky 8K guy, right? That's making you think twice about your ownership. Well, then maybe don't take a Nate Lashley, right? Maybe you try and take somebody that's closer to like 4 or 5% ownership instead. But in certain lineups, especially in certain types of contests, right, we're not worried about playing somebody that's 10-15% owned, like a single entry, let's say like a 200-300 entry type of contest, cash, higher dollar contest. Ownership might be a lot less important, right, in those kind of builds, depending on what you're working with. So in those kind of builds, Nate Lashley's just fine, right? So want to point that out. In large field GPPs, might get a little bit of steam, but I don't know if I worry about it all that much. Next up and lastly for our value plays here, we've got Harry Hall at $7,100. So I'm not a huge fan of the 6K range this week. It's a weak field, right? It kind of feels ugly to go down there, but I feel really good about Harry Hall here. He's a high upside player, one of the best putters on all the PGA Tour, and kind of like Sam Stevens, has that elite driver, right? Super long off the tee, can get wild with it, can leak strokes off the tee, but at a course without a bunch of water off the tee, kind of open, right? You're going to have to hit recovery shots if you hit it into the trees, but it's not a death sentence, right? If you hit it offline, that plays really well for Harry Hall's game. A similar golf course to that would be the Charles Schwab Challenge, of course, a tournament that he probably should have won at this year, and he's only 2.7% owned. So unlike somebody like a Nate Lashley, right, who's like 10% owned, if you need the pivot, you take a Harry Hall, right? He's only 2.7% there. The recent form, kind of like the first two plays we went through, wasn't ideal, right? Slight losers in that category, but it's Harry Hall, right? Like, we're not expecting consistency. We're not expecting him to be a lock pick this week to go out there and, like, no matter what, make the cut. The fact of the matter is, though, if he has the off the tee play, right, if he goes out there, he can spike for 4 or 5 strokes gained. Let's say he hits a few more fairways than he's used to hitting, which happened a few times last year. When that happens and he marries it up with the putter that is normally electric, you can see here gaining over a stroke per round on the bent POA surface. Well, that's when he goes out there and top 10 finishes, right? He breaks the slate for you at a super cheap price and a super low ownership number there as well. So that's what I like about Harry Hall. I believe he played last year and missed the cut. Let's see. Yeah, went out there, missed the cut here last year. So that's not ideal, but it's only 1 year's worth of course history. So we don't want to completely indict him on that. And then if we take a look at his last 36 round baseline, it's really not that great either, right? Losing 2 of the 4 categories. Short game is always going to be stout for Harry Hall, but mostly the approach play can be a negative. When he actually went out there and finished 3rd at the Charles Schwab, he lost strokes on approach. So like, that's okay. I can live with that for sure. But the off the tee play, where he's super long out there, he's going to have to dial that in, right? He's going to have to go out there, find a way to gain 3, 4, maybe even 5 strokes off the tee, which he does regularly. He did 4 or 5 times last year. And unsurprisingly, that's when he was in the optimal lineup for DFS lineups. The one thing to note about the last 12 measured rounds here is that the stats are extremely skewed. So you can see here, let's see, where is he at? He's losing 0.9 strokes per round. he lost 8 strokes off the tee in his last start. So that was over 2 rounds. I'm not really sure what happened. I'm assuming there were a lot of water balls involved for that kind of shots gained, to happen, right? Especially to a long player like a Harry Hall. Keep in mind that that's really skewing the stats here, right? In reality, he's playing a lot better than the stats indicate because of one really poor start. And hopefully that's why the ownership stays low, right? Right now, we've only got him at 2.7%. That, of course, will change throughout the week. On the Patreon, I do update ownership as we get different numbers. Even if he creeps up to like 3, maybe 4%, as people start to catch on to that, I still think he's going to be an excellent leverage play to get to. So obviously, these are 4 plays I like getting to, but just, remember, right, it depends on the rest of your lineup, right, which ones you should be choosing, right? If you need a little bit of leverage, I think this top end of the 7K range in general is a really good spot to get to. If you don't care about ownership, right, especially based on the tournament selection you're in, maybe you get to a Nate Lashley. But if you really need some salary savings, if you really need to make your lineup different, that's when a Harry Hall comes in handy. Alrighty guys, that is all I've got for the value plays this week. Before you hop on out of here, go ahead, smash that like button for me. And also, let me know in the comments who you're taking as your top value priced $8,000 and below on DraftKings. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, helps us out with the algorithm here, and it's a free way for you to go out there and support the channel. Right, hitting that like button, subscribing, commenting is the best way to show me that you guys are enjoying the content that you see, and to help get it out there to even more eyes, right? Help them out with their process. I'll share the goods with the rest of the community. You guys know the deal at this point. Appreciate the support. We'll be back tomorrow with a live stream at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So if you have any questions you want to ask me, any ideas you want to throw off me when it comes to your builds, go ahead, throw those down in the chat tomorrow. We'll go through the weather, any last second game theory notes that we need to go through, and make sure that everyone's prepared to have a week for DFS, for props, for outrights, whatever you're going with. And so we can enjoy the action at the Fortinet. I'm looking forward to it. I have missed golf over the last few weeks, and can't wait to get back after it. So let's keep the momentum going. Let's go out there, have ourselves a weekend, and I'll catch you guys for the live stream tomorrow.